Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Valerie Steele. This is the Fashion Culture program of the museum at MFIT, and I'm delighted that you're here tonight for a conversation with Professor Justine de Young, the editor and partial author of Fashion and European Art. So please join me in welcoming Justine. I wanted to start just with a picture of the cover, asking how you came up with the idea of doing this book.
Yeah, so this book had a long gestation. I organized a panel, as is so common in academic conferences. With a colleague who was also studying fashion as an art historian, were sort of unhappy with the lack of panels about fashion and art. So we were like, well, we'll just have to be the change we want to see, and we will need to organize our own. And so we put out a call, and we got scores and scores of submissions. And it was very gratifying, and we had a fantastic panel. This is all the way back in 2011.
What was the conference, CAA?
CAA, the College Art Association Conference, which is the big art history conference. Between 3,000 and 5,000 art historians, college art professors, and practicing artists attend. And so that was so successful that a few years later, we organized another panel, or I organized it solo this time, in 2014. And after that panel, I was approached actually by Raina Lewis, the editor of the Dress Cultures series for IB Taurus. She'd seen the success of the panels and encouraged me to submit a proposal, which I did then that fall in September of 2014. And then last July in 2017, the book came out. So it was a long process, but it was a really gratifying one.
But that's really wonderful. I mean, because very few conference papers end up being published these days in a volume. So, kudos to you and to Raina for noticing how great the papers were.
Right, and I should say that it went under a series of reviews, and we did invite a few other contributors to sort of round out the volume. But the core of the papers were presented at the conference.
So how did you choose the contributors? What were you looking for when you were looking for the range of papers? Because you'll see when we'll talk about it today, we'll talk not only about Justine's own article, but also about those that her contributors did.
So we were looking for a breadth of coverage because I'm a specialist in the art of the Impressionist period, but we wanted to, along with my colleague, find papers that were covering sort of the long 19th century, from 1775, as you can see, it ended up being all the way to 1925. So we were really looking for a series of case studies that would enable people to see the importance of fashion to artists and to the individual sitters at different historical moments. Yeah.
Well, that's perfect. Yes, because as you'll see, guys, what I've done is I've tried to be grilling Justine about each of the individual images that are in the book. So why don't we start with the next one? Now, this comes from your essay,
yes,
which is about art and fashion after the Commune. And I guess you should probably start by explaining to them what the Commune is, because most Americans don't study French history.
Well, there are so many revolutions and wars in French history in the 19th century, but the Paris Commune is an important one to know about, especially because it comes after another lesser-known conflict, the Franco-Prussian War. France and Prussia went to war in 1870. It lasted until 1871. They lost very, very badly. They never won a battle, and it really crushed the French idea of themselves. To us, we're sort of familiar with this idea of French losing wars, but in the 19th century, they knew that Napoleon was the great hero of the 19th century, that this hadn't happened to them as much up until then. And so they were very shocked by this, and it provoked a huge crisis of national identity. And during the war, one of the major consequences is that Prussia besieged Paris for 5 months.
Well, the Parisians were holding out, though. They refused to submit to the Prussians.
Exactly. But the government outside of Paris ended up signing armistice, that they conceded the war to the Prussians and allowed a parade through Paris by the Prussian troops, which infuriated the Parisians. And as a consequence, Paris ends up declaring itself an independent country. They declare themselves the Paris Commune, that they are a separate country from France. And this leads to a brutal civil war because the rest of France is like, no, you don't get to be an independent country. You have to be part of France. And so there's street-to-street fighting. Fires were set. Between 20 and 40,000 people were likely killed on the streets of Paris. And so it really devastated the city. And like I said, it's not very well known by us today, but at the time, it really sort of forced French people and Parisians to rethink their identity, and particularly in the aftermath, which is one of the images that you're seeing here. It's a painting painted directly after the fall of the Paris Commune, and you see here some Parisian sort of bourgeois, middle-class people poking at the body of a communard. In general, the communards were working class, and so we see deep class anxiety here, but also you see that fashion is being sort of weaponized here, that the woman in her yellow dress is defiantly not in mourning for the country, for anyone dear to her, and she's sort of posing as if she's in a fashion plate, even as the city is in ruins around her, and there's a dead body in the streets.
Well, and in fact, many of the communards were murdered by troops simply because of what they wore that marked them out as being working class.
Exactly. So it was really a sort of devastating conflict that left individual Parisians, but also artists, obviously, on the level of fashion, even designers, very confused as to how to go forward. In part because so much of the identity of the previous government that had lost the war to the Prussians, the Second Empire, led by Napoleon III, who was an emperor, had been so associated with fashion and with the French fashion industry, and in building up this image of the Parisienne, of the sophisticated French elegant woman, the perfect chic dresser. And that idea was very much associated with the previous government. And so what do you do when your whole economy in part is based on fashion, but you've suffered this horrific military defeat, and suddenly the Parisienne is a figure that's fraught because the Parisienne was a sort of classless figure. She could be even from humble backgrounds, but through her dress elevate herself. And so there was this suspicion of dressing elegantly, of being chic, especially since there was this expectation that everyone should be in mourning.
Right. So why don't we go to the next one, where you have a very interesting image and, the previous one.
Yes.
Yes, this one here.
Yes.
Because it's interesting, you've got here a provincial person, a peasant from Alsace, who's sort of the opposite of the fashionable Parisienne and also the opposite of the proletarian Parisienne.
Exactly. And so this is the sort of imagery that became very popular in the aftermath of the Paris Commune and the loss of the Franco-Prussian War. This was, it's an engraving after a painting that was exhibited at the 1872 Paris Salon, which was the annual art exhibition where contemporary artists showed their latest paintings. And this one was wildly popular. It's by Henriette Brown. And it depicts not only a provincial woman, a woman from Alsace. They'd lost the territory of Alsace to the Germans. And so the Alsatians became a big rallying cry to the French. She's got a typical Alsatian bow on her head. She's dressed up as an ambulance worker with the Red Cross on her breast. She's not in mourning, but she's definitely not fashionable either. And so this sort of image of, they sort of thought, good, honest peasant stock was a better sort of representation of the ideal French woman in this period. And so we have a whole flood of paintings of Alsatian women being exhibited at the Salon and being celebrated in the press and by the public as this is the way forward. Fashion needs to take a pause and we need to celebrate the true future of France. They often said that the sort of promise of fertility, right? That this idea of these sort of women that were raised in the fresh air of the countryside, not these poor, weak women of the cities. That sort of language gets repeated again and again. Because, of course, they'd lost so many troops. This idea of that we need to have lots of babies was very present in the minds of the government and the population.
Why don't we look at the next one, where we have a very girlish-looking young woman in the painting L'Espérance, Hope. How would you use history to try and interpret this image?
Yeah, so this image was also exhibited at the 1872 Salon, and it's an allegorical representation of hope. But in this case, you can see she's looking rather frail, and critics were not too enthusiastic about this image of hope. They didn't think it was very hopeful. It's hard to see in this image, but you can see she's sitting on ruins, on stones, like a broken down wall in the countryside. But in the background, in the far right, there's some gravestones, hastily constructed sort of wooden crosses that indicate that she's supposed to be in front of a recent battle site. And she's not dressed in contemporary fashion, so from that perspective, I guess it's good. But she's dressed in a sort of very loose-fitting garment, a sort of classical allusion to sort of a shift.
Suitable for maternity wear, fantasy.
Maybe, although they just thought she said it was too frail. That one of the critics remarked, if this is what hope looks like, what is despair? That she, is not the sort of robust, hardy, fertile, as they would say, hope for the future of France. That instead, she seems weak and not inspiring in the way that they were looking for inspiration.
And your next two are marvelous. These two portraits. You've got the Berthe Morisot and then the Carolus Duran. So why don't you talk about these two, and again, sort of how you're using evidence to interpret them?
Yeah, so these also were exhibited at the Salon. And you may be familiar with the fact that oftentimes Impressionist painters like Morisot were very controversial at the Salon and created the most stir, and paintings like the one at right by Carolus Duran, who is one of the most successful portrait painters of his generation, were perfectly acceptable and celebrated and beloved. But the surprising thing about these two images is that the reverse happened. At the 1872 Salon, it was the Morisot image that everyone was excited about and thought was perfectly appropriate and very becoming. And in part, that has to be attributed to what she's wearing, that she's wearing all black. So she seems to be in mourning, even though she's actually not at this moment. She's wearing no jewelry, no visible makeup. She does have on a wedding ring, so we know she's married. But more importantly, although it may be hard to tell, she's actually pregnant, and everyone was sort of wise to that in this depiction as well. So she's sort of symbolizing, in at least the minds of critics and the public, France's future. This is really just Morisot's portrait of her sister, who happened to be pregnant. But it took on this greater meaning in the eyes of the public. Whereas the painting at right was incredibly controversial. It's actually a painting of a Belgian woman. And we know this because Carolus Duran, it's hard to see on that image because it's a little bit dark, but he put Brussels right under his signature. So it was immediately recognizable as being a Belgian woman. And the critics saw in her actually a figure of threat. They thought she was very dangerous looking as a woman, but
like
also
a courtesan?
No, not like a courtesan, like she could physically kill you. There were lots of remarks about her large hands and what they could do to you. And, is she hiding a knife? And this fear of women is in part a result of the events of the Paris Commune, where women did fight side by side with men. And it really was a frightening sort of, in their mind, role reversal, that we had women taking up arms. And so they saw in women maybe not for the first time, but maybe this possibility of violence that they, in my mind at least, transferred to this poor woman, Belgian lady, who was very fashionably dressed. Everyone thought her clothes were beyond reproach, but she did not adhere, as you might guess, to the ideal of French femininity of the period, in that she was too large for the body ideals of the period.
Well, what's interesting, of course, is in 1848, one of the earlier revolutions in France, women did sometimes wear trousers, as they did in the Commune. Mm-hmm. And again, the fact that there were so many revolutions or failed revolutions in 1789, 1830, 1848, 1871, in a way it put women back, either because they were seen as being too dangerous, like these female revolutionaries, or because they were seen as being too right-wing and associated with the church. So the revolution was going to have an equality between men, but women had to get back in the home and sort of get in line.
And that's definitely the ideology of the Third Republic, that the government that takes over after the fall of the Second Empire, after the Franco-Prussian War. So this image really gave the salon audience and the critics an opportunity to sort of weigh in on what their ideal woman looks like and how she differs so dramatically from that ideal. One critic, Castagnery, had maybe the meanest thing to say and called her a fat cow. Another called her a fishwife turned countess. So they really didn't pull any punches. Even so, you see the sort of limits of what dressing fashionably could do for you, that they still were very strict about their body ideals, sort of like
yes.
the exhibition we have
very
right
much
now.
So, right. The little girl in white was too skinny, and this one is too plump.
Exactly.
Well, look at the next one. The next one is from your colleague, Amelia Rausser's article, From the Studio to the Street, which explores modeling neoclassical dress in art and life. So I guess if we start with this wonderful, almost bare-breasted woman, this is a pretty revealing dress. Who, if anyone, would have worn this in 1798?
So this was very briefly a style in line with Enlightenment ideals about sort of the dressing naturally, moving away from the artificiality they associated with people like Marie Antoinette and the Rococo, these really wide silhouettes supported by corsetry and panniers, which were sort of baskets at the hips, and large extravagant wigs. After the French Revolution, fashion goes in entirely the opposite direction. We have these body-hugging silhouettes. And this idea of transparency at the breasts was in part linked to that idea of the natural role of women. And the natural role of women in the mind of the 18th century philosopher was to bear children. And so the revealing of the breasts associated women with maternity and with that maternal role. And it was a limited fashion. We know it was remarked on in journals of the time. It was shown in fashion plates and caricatures. It's obviously included in this portrait. So we know that a subset of women dressed in this fashion. Others wore dresses very similar, but without the transparency. These very body-hugging, sort of classically inspired white dresses that were aimed to be more natural, and they associated that with Greek and Roman style dressing.
Well, of course, I assume that your colleague mentioned, of course, Marie Antoinette did scandalize Paris when she wore a chemise dress, a white high-waisted dress, and was portrayed in such a dress, shown at the Salon. People freaked out, and the painting had to be pulled quickly and replaced by a painting of her wearing a formal court gown with her 2 children.
Yeah, they thought she looked like she was wearing her underwear.
Right.
So it had caused a stir, and there's lots of different origin stories for this style of dressing. And that's what the essay actually explores, is another sort of facet of why did this become fashionable. And it's in part, as she argues, from the sort of studio practice of artists and artist models, that in the 18th century it was popular to dress in the sort of classically inspired drapery that you see on the right, where we have an artist painting a self-portrait as the muse of painting. So she's taking inspiration from the goddess Minerva. She has a cameo at her waist that includes an image of Minerva. I know you can't see it from there, but she's associating herself with this goddess of wisdom and of the arts. and is dressing in a way that is a sort of a quasi-classical drapery.
So the artist Angelica Kaufmann, she's wearing a kind of allegorical costume as opposed to a fashionable dress per se?
Exactly, but it did become very common for portraiture, not only for self-portraiture, but as a sort of broader studio practice. And so in this article or essay, Rausser argues that this influenced fashionable trends, especially when we talk about, with your indulgence, the figure that you see at left. Her name is Emma Hamilton, and she is wearing a very similar sort of garb that, again, is classically inspired. And she was one of the greatest celebrities of the 18th century with a crazy personal story. Google her on Wikipedia, and you'll have a fun ride. But to give you a brief recap, she's an artist model, she's an actress, she becomes mistress to several gentlemen.
Sold by one to the other.
Sold by one to the other, yes. And she ends up in Naples, where she becomes famous for performing what she called her attitudes. So they were classical characters from myth, from history, that she would do dances, sort of mime famous positions of sculptures or paintings, and apparently was quite the sensation. George Romney, the painter, sort of fell in love with her and painted her endlessly, which helped her become even more famous. And everyone's tried to take credit for designing her gowns. And so she became the sort of fashion icon. She marries at 26 Sir Hamilton, becoming Lady Hamilton. Sir Hamilton is 60 years old when this marriage takes place. And then she famously becomes the mistress of Lord Nelson, the great British naval commander. So she stays very much in public consciousness as this sort of fashion leader, celebrity, one of the most beautiful women of the 18th century.
So you have her there, and then another woman artist, again wearing this kind of classicizing dress in her studio.
And this is maybe also an allusion to an even more famous female artist in this period, Vigée Lebrun. Maybe you saw the exhibition at the Met a few years ago. It's thought to depict Vigée Lebrun and a student in the 1780s. And here you can see the contrast between what the student is wearing, which was very much in accord with 18th century fashions, and with the sort of studio dress of the instructor of Vigée Lebrun here at right. And again, a detail, but the painting on the easel, they're venerating a sculpture of Minerva, who really becomes the sort of rallying cry for female artists in this period.
Well, with your next set of pictures, another of your colleagues, Heather Jensen, looks at Josephine Bonaparte's influence on fashion. And we see now what had been the chemise dress and the directoire dress now becomes the empire dress.
Exactly. And here, Jensen really emphasizes the importance of fashion and the portraiture of Josephine in sort of supporting the Napoleonic Empire, and that she was very conscious in what she decided to wear and how she wore it in order to reflect the sort of goals of the empire and the expanse of the empire. So at left, in her coronation robes, she's of course wearing French silks, French velvets. That mantle is said to have taken 25 yards of velvet and to have weighed 80 pounds, which seems almost impossible to believe, but I believe it. It's all lined in ermine, one of the most expensive furs, and it's covered, as you can see, in embroidery with the symbol of the bee. Napoleon assigned bees to Josephine, and he got stars as his symbol. So she's here dressed to sort of symbolize the best of the fashion industries, the best of what French textile manufacturers can produce. She also has a lace collar. So again, Napoleon saw the importance of fashion to the French economy, and so he and his wife worked together to revive it after the tumult of the French Revolution.
And then the other one, the other picture, she's looking much more sort of exotic and erotic. sort of stretched out again in the sort of chemise gown, and then with the wonderful cashmere shawl.
Yes.
Which she collected, incredibly expensive.
They were incredibly expensive. She was given one by Napoleon that cost 10,000 francs, which is a lot of money. And she owned hundreds of these shawls. She really was an avid collector, even though they were imported, which Napoleon actually wasn't fond of. He was constantly threatening to ban them or threatening to seize them from his wife and daughters and toss them into the fire because they were, in this case, supporting oftentimes the British.
Coming in from India,
coming
which
in from
was already
India.
slowly being colonized. Yeah.
Exactly. And here she's actually wearing a very much lighter weight. The Jensen argues a sort of cotton muslin gown, but the way that she made it French, since cotton was again associated with the British colonies, was that it's covered in star-spangled embroidery. So she's sort of getting away with wearing the lighter fabrics that she preferred by having French industry work really intensively on them. She was born in Martinique, and so she had a real preference for these lighter weight fabrics. But of course, the silks were what France was famous for, and so what she was expected to wear when she was at court.
So let's look at the next couple.
Okay, so here you can see more shawls. She has a bit of a shawl obsession. She's even turned a shawl into a dress on the left. That's actually sort of a tunic that she's fashioned into a sort of shift dress that she then has another shawl draped on top of. So she's really layering on these different pieces and showing the sort of expansive empire and the sort of power of Napoleon, in that these shawls in part became popular after Napoleon had his Egyptian campaign. He saw these shawls on the Mameluke soldiers, these Egyptian soldiers, and that's one of the ways that they came into France. At the right, you see yet another set of shawls, but what's more unusual, you may notice, is that she's wearing a coral necklace. And coral is less common as a fine jewelry material, but in this case it associates her with the Mediterranean and with the fact that France had obtained exclusive rights to coral as a consequence of Napoleon's conquests. Yeah. And so she's wearing what is now very patriotic jewelry.
And your next colleague, Susan Siegfried, looks at costume and fashion from the Romantic era. So we've got a couple of theater and opera costumes here. How can theatrical costume tell us about the, ideas of a particular period?
Yeah, so here on the right you have a figure from the opera, the La Muette de Porty, which in this case is set in the 17th century. In the 19th century, though, they start as costume designers to think about reviving or actually trying to dress a little bit more authentically. Up until this period, there'd been a lot of just wearing whatever was fashionable at the time. And it didn't really matter what time period your opera or play was set in. But here you can see an attempt at dressing this character, who's supposed to be the mute sister of the fisherman that starts an uprising against the Spanish. So,
Spanish or Italy?
They're in Italy.
Right.
So she's Neapolitan. She's
right.
the Neapolitan sister of the fisherman who starts the uprising against
right.
the Spanish. Because in the 17th century Spain...
This was a big hit.
Yes, it was. It's the first grand opera, French grand opera. And she was also considered one of the great beauties of the age. And so you see an attempt at rendering 17th century costume here. Right. On the left, it's actually meant to be a sort of straight fashion plate of historic costume, of what a person would have worn in the time of Louis XIII, who again is from the 17th century. So we have this interest in looking back into the past and in trying to research historic dress in a way that most other periods hadn't done, hadn't been as interested. And we can see that sort of attempt to create a sort of historical narrative at the right. This is thought to be the first ever fashion history timeline. So we have...
so you must have been excited to find it.
I am, yes. But it's a little hard to read, but I think it jumps from 1500 all the way to like 1760, and then 1790, and then all the rest of these figures are from the beginning of the 19th century. So they're still working out, having a regular period. They certainly are not dividing things up into decades, but they are attempting to chart how things have changed over time. And you can see that attempt at right. And then on the left, you see a plate that is titled Le Goût Nouveau, so the new taste. This new taste for historical dressing. And that you can see fashion designers in this period are sort of benefiting from all this historical research. And they're combining, the sleeves of the 1630s with the ruff of the 1560s, with the ferronnière, the sort of metal circlet of the 1490s. So they're sort of creating these hodgepodge fashions that become very fashionable.
Well, and it's so interesting, too, because during the Revolutionary period and just before, you have them idealizing ancient Greece and Rome, you sort of democracy, reason, classicism, and then later with the revival of the monarchy, you have them looking back at sort of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and sort of mixing it all together with a romanticization of this past.
Mm-hmm. So they definitely are also always seeking for new inspirations. And so, this is a very familiar cycle to us today, that designers these days oftentimes are looking back to the past or reviving a certain era. But we're just starting to see that happen in fashion in the 1830s. That's when designers really start to mine a lot of the earlier decades, centuries for ideas. And this revivalism will last all the way up until the present moment.
Yeah. Your next scholar, Julie Codell, looks at Rosetti's paintings in terms of images of a new kind of femininity, and in particular in relation to the class or unclassifiability of the sitters. Do you want to talk a little bit about how Rosetti did this? Because as Americans, we're not really trained to think in terms of class, and yet that was something so obvious to a British audience then.
Yes, they found these paintings very confusing because what Rosetti did is that he sort of rejected contemporary fashion almost entirely. He fashioned his own sort of garments out of exotic materials. He raided secondhand shops. Vintage wasn't really a thing in this period, but he was buying all these exotic jewelry from other cultures and sort of collaging it together into these women that suddenly become unplaceable. In the 19th century, as Val was mentioning, there was a big investment in being able to look at a woman and tell what class she was and who she was, where she was from, what her morality was like. You could just tell from looking at someone that was the belief. But these women, you just couldn't class, even though they're in general working class women. They're wearing very luxurious textiles, but ones that don't follow the silhouette of contemporary fashion whatsoever, and that they're also wearing these unusual accessories. Coral makes a reappearance here. She's wearing that long strand of coral beads, but she also has an owl feather fan. Ostrich feather fans were very fashionable. You see a few other bird feathers, but owl feathers, much more unusual. And so he's really creating these sort of mysterious women that you have to take on their own terms.
And many of them are redheads, too, which was very much looked down on in 19th century England as being scandalous, but also sort of witchy and unnatural.
But it slowly becomes
fashionable. Exactly. Yes, Mrs. Howise writes and says what was formerly scorned is now sort of fashionable.
But yes, he does definitely, as you'll see, have an obsession with the redheaded lady. I mean, it's a very understandable obsession, but he really did confuse people. But he was a little bit independent from the functioning of the market, so he wasn't exhibiting these pictures publicly, and so he could create these sort of fantasies, and he had a stable of clients who would buy them, and so he didn't need to conform in the way that paintings that were being submitted to the Paris Salon that were going to be judged by a jury needed to conform. He had a lot more freedom because of his relationship with his patrons.
So what were some of these alternative femininities he was expressing? I mean, were these in any way like people from the aesthetic movement? I mean, he knew people from the sort of arts and crafts movement.
Right. So he was moving in those circles, but he, in this case, is sort of creating his own vision. It's not quite in the same vein as the aesthetic painters. So he really just seems to be taking a real pleasure in the beauty of the women and the beauty of the objects, and the sort of excess of it all. He's combining all sorts of influences, like I mentioned. The figure in the foreground holding the vase of flowers is wearing both African and Norwegian jewelry. She's the central figure of the beloved, is wearing an Indian bracelet, a Japanese kimono, and a Chinese kingfisher feather headdress. So she's really very eclectic, but very appealing to Rosetti's clientele and to Rosetti himself. And this sort of mysterious femininity that couldn't quite be nailed down is, as you're saying, one of these alternative femininities that he was such a big proponent of. But really, they defy any connection to contemporary fashion. And that's why, I thought it was so important in the book to have these case studies, because as you probably already can see, at different historical moments, different artists, different sitters all have very different goals. And you can't sort of generalize that all artists who treat fashion or paint fashion do X, Y, and Z. That you really do need to look at the specificity of the moment, of the artist, of the beliefs of the time, of the ideals of the moment.
Well, and your next image, of course, which is chosen for the cover, comes from a really fascinating essay by Emmeline Butterfield Rosen, who wrote Mannequin and Monkey in Seurat's Grand Jatte. So this is so freaky, but tell us, what did she discover about the mannequin and the monkey?
Yes.
So you see the tiny little monkey up there.
Right here. She's got a monkey on a leash. So she discovered a whole another sort of layer of meaning to this picture that art historians had not yet found up until now. This is a familiar image. That's why we chose it for the cover. And it's striking in part because it looks so monumental and frozen. But what people didn't realize at the time is that people really connected these figures to fashion mannequins, to sort of department store displays, and that sort of stiff formality of them, the rigidity of them. Art historians up until now have often compared them to sort of Egyptian sculpture, and it's certainly possible that Seurat has that in mind. But it seems, I think, following what Emmeline has to say, even more likely that he is thinking about these department store displays and the full-length mannequins, but also the half-length bust mannequins that he's showing in profile that was so typical of displays in this period.
And the monkey?
And the monkey.
Yes.
So yes, you can't forget the monkey. So the monkey is a really interesting thing to include because it really connects this idea of dressing and the idea of imitation, so mimicry, that was very much being talked about at that moment because of Charles Darwin. This idea that we evolved from monkeys, and that imitation, mimicry. In French, the word is singerie, which is mimicry. Singe is the word for monkey. So this idea that the woman is sort of imitating everyone around her, in the way that monkeys see, monkey do, right? In the way that monkeys imitate things that women in particular were thought to be susceptible to the influence of following what other people are doing. And so having the monkey there sort of makes that connection to contemporary anxieties even more explicit.
It's really interesting because, of course, the term singe de la cour, that you're a monkey of the court, was copying court fashion, applied to men as well as women, but here fashion has become seen as just a woman's thing.
Exactly, and that's a slow shift over the course of the 19th century, but an important one that feels so familiar to us today, but it was a big shift that we saw even in fashion magazines of the time, that up until the 1850s, men and women appeared in fashion magazines together, but after then, you start to see a sort of separation where fashion magazines start to be for women, and there's just tailoring magazines for men. but I won't leave the thread of the monkey behind.
No, here's more monkey.
We have a lot more monkey things coming. So you may or may not know that Darwin in the 19th century was often caricatured as a monkey. So you see him at left talking to a fashionable lady in her bustled dress. And that troubles our monkey again. The caption reads, "Really, Mr. Darwin, say what you like about man, but I wish you would leave my emotions alone." And this is in response to his publishing not The Origin of the Species, but The Descent of Man, which went into psychology and emotions and caused even more of a uproar. But the image at right, I think, sort of helps reinforce this idea that women were seen as sort of monkey-like in their imitation of fashions, that we have this sort of bustle being transformed into a tail, and this sort of caricature on the right is sort of emphasizing the monkey-woman connection in a sort of wonderful way. In fact, this wasn't originally included in the essay, but my contributor Emmeline discovered it just as we were about to go to press, and it was so wonderful that the press graciously agreed to metaphorically stop the presses and get it added into the volume, because it really does show that sort of confluence, or this sort of linkage, this idea of women and imitation and monkeys.
I did a double take when I looked at this again today, because last Friday I saw Cendrillon at the opera, and one of the characters was dressed in a costume where the bustle turned into a tail. And I thought, oh, I've seen that before. And here we have the wonderful, the models, les poseuses. Now they're mostly naked, although one of them has her stockings on, but they have their clothes displayed all around them. And what does the author make of all of that?
Well, it also, of course, includes a reprisal of the Grand Jatte image at left. But crucially, when he redid this picture, or created this picture, he blocks out the monkey, because the monkey had caused a huge stir when he exhibited the painting in the Last Impressionist exhibition of 1886. And so he sort of covers up the objectionable monkey with our nude
objectionable
model,
nude.
with our much less objectionable nude. And it's a way to answer the criticisms, right, that his women were too stiff, they were like mannequins. Instead, he's showing live models that have a naturalness to them. Even though they're posed, they're clearly not in the frozen poses of a display window. Yes, and he covers up the monkey.
All right, now we're going to menswear with your next one. This was by Andrew Stevenson's essay, But the Coat is the Picture. Want to explain how this investigates masculine self-fashioning?
Definitely. But the coat is the picture is actually an exclamation that John Singer Sargent, the painter of the image at left, made when Graham Robertson, who's the subject of this portrait, objected to wearing the overcoat in the heat of summer. So the poor gentleman had agreed to pose for Sargent, but Sargent insisted that he wear this heavy wool overcoat for days and days on end. He started wasting away. He apparently lost more than 10 pounds posing before the era of air conditioning in this heavy jacket. And when he protested that he had to take it off, Sargent, of course, said, but the coat is the picture. I think maybe the poodle with the yellow bow is the picture, but no, the coat in this period is sort of standing in for, as you can see, a sort of elegant, refined masculinity, almost dandyish. That was becoming even more common in sort of aesthetic circles in the 1890s, and that his sort of dynamic pose, sort of momentariness of the picture, that it looks like he's just paused as he's about to go out, was very widely celebrated as sort of capturing this new idea of masculinity, a sort of alternative masculinity.
Was Graham Robinson gay?
He was, and
Sargent was, of course.
And so this whole essay is sort of exploring the portraiture in sort of aesthetic circles, in sort of the gay community. All of these portraits before the indecency trial of Oscar Wilde in 1895, which would make any sort of association with quote-unquote deviant behavior, completely unacceptable in portraiture. But in this period, there was a bit more freedom in terms of how men could be depicted. And you can see an example in the picture of Graham Robinson, in contrast to the advertisement for the overcoat, right, which is a much more stiff and not quite as dynamic or dandified portrayal. But here you can see two other gentlemen, Charles Condor at left, who again is even more frozen in a particular moment, where this sort of overcoat, this idea of the man on the move, was...
Dance-like motion, like a whirling dervish. It's fantastic.
Yeah, was really an incredible sort of portraiture choice, that they're sort of pushing the boundaries of what you could expect in a conventional portrait. And so the essay sort of delves into those circles.
And Edward Carpenter, and the other portrait, of course, was the great sexologist and advocate of, greater sexual freedom, including for gay men.
Exactly.
This is from Kimberly Wall's essay, Silencing Fashion in Early 20th Century Feminism, where she looks at a lot of fascinating fashion images from suffragist journals. Mm-hmm. So what does this one tell us about?
Well, so this one is from Votes for Women, which was a suffragette publication. Suffragettist.
Suffragist or suffragette?
Suffragist.
Yes, yeah, I think suffragist.
Suffragists
were more.
And you can see the title is Time to Shut Up Shop. And what we see being depicted is a sort of metaphor for the debate over suffrage, women's suffrage in this period. The woman selling the hat, Mrs. Humphrey Ward, she wasn't actually a hat seller, but she was a very vehement anti-suffrage campaigner. And so you see her being depicted here in the fashions of the 1850s.
Not just wrong-headed, but out of date.
Exactly. And so the caption says, "Woman of today, surely you don't expect me to put up with any of these very outdated fashions." And Mrs. Humphrey Ward replies, "I'm sorry, we have nothing newer. This style of thing gave every satisfaction 50 years ago. So why should things change?" Right? So using fashion here to sort of stand in for outdated ideas.
Or the old-fashioned for it, because the new fashion is clearly for the modern suffragist woman.
Exactly.
And in fact, the next picture also, you have very fashionable woman and a mother, but looking over the Houses of Parliament. So using fashionable dress to indicate that this was just the kind of woman who deserved the vote, right?
Exactly. She's wearing one of those large picture hats that became so fashionable. And in general, most suffragettes embraced fashionable dress because they knew it made their message more acceptable. And they wore, I guess, conservative fashions in the sense that they didn't push the limits. They weren't wearing poirees, hobble skirts, or harem pants. But they were dressing very much in line with contemporary taste because they wanted the focus to be not on what they were wearing, but on what they were advocating for. And this is a very pivotal moment when there's a bill in front of the Houses of Parliament. You'll see it says Conciliation Bill. And this was a bid to give women the right to vote, women of a certain class, women of a certain age. And it fails in 1910, although the suffragettes rally to its defense. But of course, in 1918, they do succeed. So we're at the 100th anniversary of suffrage for women in England this year.
Now we have not so much more time and a few more pictures, so we'll go quickly. We've got a couple more of the suffragette images.
Right, and so this is to just emphasize that they not only used contemporary fashion, but also ideals of classical womanhood in some of their public images, like you see the poster at left, the appeal of womanhood. She's wearing, again, the sort of quasi-classically draped dress. That was used as an appeal to a broader public who may not care about fashion, but these sort of more eternal ideas of womanhood. So they weren't, completely strict in their use of fashionable dress. They used also appeals to sort of old England. She's supposed to be dressed like a good woman of the 18th century. So they used all sorts of imagery.
And the last article by Anna Zoll, Puppets patterns, and proper gentlemen. You stretched the long 19th century way past World War I to the 1920s, but this is an interesting look at men's fashion in Weimar Germany and in the painting of the new objectivity. So if we just conclude with these two pictures, what about this young man with his yellow gloves?
Well, I really loved this image, and I thought it was a good one to end the volume on because it shows, again, the sort of tailor's dummy now being used as a model for masculinity, that he's showing sort of the hollowness, the stiffness of the sort of masculine ideal in the 20th century, in the aftermath of World War I, where the body has suffered in so many ways. There's lots of prosthetic limbs in post-war Germany, and that you see the sort of failure of the black suit to be modern in this case, that there was a sort of criticism at this moment that women now in the 20s were being the modern ones, and that men were being left behind, that they were dressing in the old-fashioned styles. But they took refuge in this idea of the proper gentleman, that was going to be the way forward that would save post-war Germany.
And the artist himself is shown in the other picture.
Right, so he's modeling this figure on himself, or vice versa.
This is one of August Sander's illustrations of typical types then.
Definitely.
Well, now we have some questions here from Tanya, from the audience. So let's see what we have. Because I know you're also going to want to go and see the books, which are for sale upstairs. But here's one. How influential was the demi-monde in terms of fashion?
So again, this depends on the period, but very in general. That some canny fashion designers like Charles Frederick Worth didn't discriminate. Right, he would pay. He would make dresses for anyone who could pay, and women at all levels of society were wearing dresses by the great couture houses, and they had a lot of visibility at court, but also, at new sites of leisure like Longchamp, the race courses, where people would go watch jockeys and races. And yeah, they definitely had a strong influence on fashion.
Well, I mean, if anything, I think they were probably among the greatest fashion leaders, because they were unconstrained by traditions of modesty. And women complained at the time that their husbands would give so much more money to their mistresses. And of course, the husbands then would want to have the mistress all dressed up in the latest thing with great jewelry because it testified to his success as a high liver. And she was doing it because it testified to her success as sort of a courtesan. Mm-hmm. Second question, how did photography change fashion?
So that's a big question.
Yeah, that's a good one.
But photography actually starts to have an influence on fashion a little bit later than you might think, because of the limitations of publications, of incorporating photos into printed journals. It's not until the early 20th century that you start to regularly see fashion magazines include photographs. And so although images of fashion were circulating and available, and people were getting themselves photographed, you don't really start to have these great fashion photographers until the early 20th century, when they start going to places like Longchamp to take photos of the people in the audience watching the races. And that sort of is the sort of first street, or quasi-street photography. And then you start to see that influence more. But before that, a lot of what people were wearing on the stage, so actresses,
Yep.
In addition to what was being worn at court or among the demi-monde, were more likely to be your fashion leaders.
Yes. Please join me in thanking Justine DeYoung.